In this lecture, I want to discuss Scholasticism, which was a movement that arose out of the universities that came about during the medieval period. Probably one of the highlights, actually, of medieval Christianity and medieval culture. Scholasticism and scholastic theology are the names that historians have given to theological teaching that dominated Western universities in the Middle Ages. The term scholastic comes from the word school. You are school students, and so you are scholastics in a sense. It simply means school theology. The theology in the schools, in other words, in the universities, in the medieval universities, developed during that time. The scholastic theologians are often called the schoolmen, and you'll hear the Reformers and the Puritans refer to them as the schoolmen if you read any of their writings, which you will in subsequent church history classes here in North Greenville. The schoolmen developed a distinctive approach to theology. And so we can kind of summarize their theology and their style and their outlook as follows. First, the first big point here we need to note is faith and reason. The scholastic theologians were deeply concerned about the relationship between faith and reason. They wanted to see how far pure reason, as they called it, could discover or prove the doctrines of the Christian faith. Could we reason our way to God? What could the human mind find out about God by investigating the created world without referring to God's special revelation, the Bible? For example, what could unaided reason discover of the existence of God in the creation, or the Trinity, or in God's providence? If reason alone could not discover or prove a particular doctrine, could it still be shown to be in harmony with reason? Just for instance, even if we cannot discover the Trinity by pure reason, can we still demonstrate that the Trinity does not contradict reason, that it is a rational doctrine? Can something be false from the viewpoint of reason, but according to divine revelation, be true? Different schoolmen, and we'll look at schoolmen in another lecture, just summarize a few of the main scholastic theologians who are very important in the development of theology in church history. The different schoolmen gave different answers to these vital questions, but they were united in asking the same question. So faith and reason. Another important sort of development during this time that was at the heart of scholasticism was systematic theology. Of course, you probably have studied or will study or take systematic theology, and that was my minor as a PhD student, systematic theologies, and I love to read systematic theologies and have dozens of them in my library. But the scholastic theologians wanted to offer a complete systematic account of the Christian faith, of Christian truth, of Christian doctrine. This meant examining a particular doctrine logically from every point of view. But it meant more than that. A typical schoolman would try to bring all Christian doctrines together into a system of theology which set forth and explained the entire body of revealed truth. They called such a system a summa. Summa, Latin word summa, which means summary. A summary. In their pursuit of a universal system of doctrine, the schoolmen often spent a great deal of time and effort inquiring into questions which most Christians in later ages would find pointless. For example, could God have become incarnate as an animal or as a woman? Could one angel be in two places at the same time? Can two angels be in the same place at the same time? Who sinned the most, Adam or Eve? After all, Eve gave him the fruit, right? Who sinned the most? So these are some of the questions that they sought to deal with. Some of them do seem a bit absurd to us. Another one of the key points to underscore here, in addition to systematic theology and faith and reason, is the philosophy and writings of Aristotle. As well as being theologians, the schoolmen were also the philosophers of the Middle Ages. They wanted to give a comprehensive account, not just of church teaching, but of all truth, comprehensively. So they did not limit themselves to theological questions. They would try to answer deep theological questions too. Things like, what is matter? What is mind? What is time? What is space? What is being? What is the nature of cause and effect? One of the great debates which the schoolmen carried on was the conflict between realism on the one hand and nominalism on the other. Realism and nominalism. This concerned the relationship between one, an individual thing, like a particular fish or a particular human being, and two, what made that individual thing the same as other things of the same kind. What made all fish fish? The general idea of fish. Is there fishness in a fish or dogness to a dog? Or what different human beings have in common? In general, humanity. What is humanity? The general idea was called a universal. Realists, influenced by the Greek philosopher Plato, held that the universal was more real than the individual thing. The universal was more real than the individual thing. It's kind of hard to get our minds around this. We have to put our thinking caps on here. For instance, the idea of humanity was more real than any individual being, human being, and it existed independently of the various people in whom humanity had an individual existence. Nominalists, often influenced by the philosopher Aristotle, held the opposite. Individual things were more real than the universal. So these were opposite philosophies, if you will. The general idea of humanity was just a name. Nomen, hence nominalism. That's the Latin, nomen, hence nominalism. Just a name. It had no reality of its own apart from individual human beings. There's no humanness apart from individual human beings like you and me. There were various views which took a middle course between realism and nominalism. And debate did, though it can seem a little silly to us today, it really wasn't at all and isn't. It had serious implications for theology. For example, an extreme nominalist would deny any reality to the general idea of divinity or deity or divine essence, seeing the three persons of the Godhead or the Trinity as existing in their own right as separate individuals, kind of a tritheism. In that case, how can we avoid saying the Father, Son, and the Spirit are three gods? And of course, there are religions that accuse the Orthodox Christian faith of believing in three gods. Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, those modern-day Arians we saw in a few lectures back, argue that evangelical Christians hold to a tritheism, that Roman Catholics hold to a tritheism. They're three gods, not one God in three persons. Now, among the famous scholastic theologians, John Wycliffe was an ardent realist. William of Ockham was a zealous nominalist. So you have good people on both sides. And Thomas Aquinas, one of the most famous and greatest theologians in the history of the church, and certainly of the Middle Ages, he kind of pursued a middle course, a via media. In the 13th century, scholastic theology came to rely increasingly on the philosophy of Aristotle. Aristotle lived about 384 to 322 BC. Aristotle was one of the greatest of the ancient pagan philosophers of Greece. A few of Aristotle's works have been known to the early schoolmen because Boetius in the 6th century had translated them into Latin. However, all of Aristotle's writings became available in Latin in the 1100s, largely through two great Muslim philosophers, Persian Avicenna and the Spanish Averroes. They translated Aristotle from Greek into Arabic for the benefit of the Islamic world. Christian scholars, such as Michael Scotus of Toulouse, then translated the Arabic, along with Islamic commentaries on Aristotle, into Latin for the benefit of the Western Catholic world. Arabic translations of Aristotle found their way into Catholic Europe, chiefly through Muslim Spain, especially after 1085 when the Spanish Christians conquered the Muslim city of Toledo, which had been the capital city of the Spanish Muslim kingdom of Cordova. Later scholars translated Aristotle into Latin directly from the original Greek. Now, this rediscovery of Aristotle by Western Europe had a huge impact on Western thought. In the writings of Aristotle, Christian thinkers found an interpretation of God and humanity and the world which seemed logical. It seemed convincing and comprehensive, a complete worldview that had been worked out without any reference to the Bible. But now the problem was that some of Aristotle's teaching were opposed to Scripture, to sacred Scripture, to the Bible. For example, Aristotle taught that the world had always existed. Some Western thinkers were so enthusiastic for Aristotle, especially as he had been interpreted by the Muslim philosopher Averroes, they had accepted and taught even the anti-Christian elements in his thought. These were called Averroists, Averroists, if you're taking notes, and you are. And their greatest champion was Siger of Brabant. Siger taught that the universe had existed from all eternity, and that individual human souls were not immortal, but were absorbed into a world soul after death. Siger at first lectured in Paris, but when the church condemned his teachings as heretical in 1276, Siger fled to Italy. They did not prove to be much of a safe haven. This did not. And since Siger was murdered there by a priest whose enthusiasm for orthodoxy proved stronger than his respect for the sixth commandment, "You shall not murder." To defend themselves against charges of heresy, the Averroists put forward a theory of double truth. This theory of double truth held that human reason by itself would compel philosophers to accept certain things as truth. But then divine relativism showed that those things were false and something else was really the truth. So this double truth theory set reason and faith in sharp contrast to one another. And we've seen that really throughout history. Faith and reason are different things. And you probably hear this even in sharing the gospel, that, well, you have a faith and that's a leap in the dark, but I have reason, I have a logic, and those two are very different things. And of course, the reformers would come along, and even some of the scholastic theologians, and reject that entirely, as they should. So this double truth set reason and faith in sharp conflict. It meant that if a person followed reason, he was bound to end up believing some things that contradicted revelation. Now, at first, many Catholic theologians reacted against Aristotle and saw his philosophy as a dangerous alternative to Christianity, especially in view of what the Averroists were saying. Up until then, the Western Church had found the philosophy of Plato to be the most suitable ally of Christian thought, of Christian theology, especially since Augustine of Hippo, of course, we met him a couple of weeks back, the greatest of all Western theologians, had been a Platonist. But Aristotle disagreed with some of Plato's basic teachings. For example, Plato held that the human soul had a direct inner knowledge of a higher spiritual world, and that this knowledge did not depend on our experience of life in the outward physical world. So we derive our fundamental ideas, such as beauty and justice, from this inner knowledge. Aristotle, however, taught that all human knowledge arose from experience, mediated to the soul through the senses, the touch, the taste, the hearing, the seeing, the feeling. Through these five senses, what we can see and hear and touch, we can know that a spiritual being like God exists, then only by reasoning from our experience to the eternal world. The soul cannot have any direct or immediate spiritual knowledge of God. Now, many traditional Catholic theologians preferred Plato to Aristotle, and they led a campaign to ban the study of Aristotle's writings. For a time, they enjoyed a measure of success. However, by the 13th century, the tide had turned in Aristotle's favor, and scholastic theologians were hailing him as the great pagan forerunner of Christian truth, whose philosophy was almost perfectly suited to undergird, express, and explain the theology of the church. The schoolmen now sought to bring together Aristotle's philosophy and Christian theology into one harmonious unity, much as today's theologians often try to marry theology to the latest scientific theory about the origin of the universe or humankind. We see that all the time, don't we? The theological upheavals Aristotle caused the Western Catholic world had no parallel in the Orthodox East, where the knowledge of Aristotle had never been lost. The Greek in which Aristotle wrote did not need to be translated for Byzantine theologians, because it was their native language. Eastern theology had absorbed and adapted itself the philosophy of both Plato and Aristotle in roughly equal doses. In fact, in some ways, orthodoxy had something of a bias in favor of Aristotle, because Platonism always formed the philosophical basis on which anti-Christian pagan thought tried, now and then, to make a reappearance in the East, in contrast to the Western Aristotelian paganism of Siger of Brabant. There was therefore no revival of Aristotelian philosophy in the East, no sudden Aristotelian challenge to throw orthodox theology off balance, and no Eastern equivalent of Western scholasticism. And so with this, in the next lecture, we turn to the great scholastic theologians, who many of whom, or several of whom, formed an important basis in the theology of the church.